Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 22nd of July. We have a lot of important developments beginning with Maximilianivka, a very important village where the Russians have achieved a penetration. We'll also look across the Horivka and then look further north at the situation developing around the Toretsk and New York, where we do have really important updates from both towns. And then we'll finish off by looking at the Chasiv Yar front. Let's begin by looking at southern Donetsk, where we do have, as said before, this really important geolocation. We know about this video because it was posted on the Telegram channel of the Sewer Beavers drone unit, which is a part of the 3rd Air Mobile Battalion of the 46th Air Assault Brigade, which has been operating now for, I believe, 3 or 4 months in the region, either around Krasnohorivka or further south in the Kurakhove and nearby fields. And so they've been the unit primarily in charge of trying to repel any sort of Russian advances that are occurring along this horizontal road that bisects various villages, starting in Marinka and then going further and further westward. And they are also getting support, as we've previously covered, from at least the 3rd Air Assault Battalion of the 79th Air Assault Brigade. And then the 2nd Battalion is also floating around here, perhaps with more responsibilities in some of the fields further south. So in yesterday's video, we talked about how the Russian forces, utilizing several armored assets, were able to advance about 600 meters westwards and get control over some of the hinterlands between Pobieda and Kurakhove. This is such an important region because you do have some defensive density based on the yellow lines here, showing that the Ukrainians at least do have some trenches that were built in a vertical fashion to protect the line of contact and protect the road over here, this highway. But after that point, there is a rather large stretch of land spanning 7.6 kilometers that is relatively open. And that area is totally exposed to any sort of Russian vehicular assaults. And the Russians do have a very large garrison of vehicles. We have seen decreases in the volume and in the intensity of Russian columns on various parts of the front line. But one area where the Russians are still extremely capable and still do conduct a lot of these larger scale vehicular assaults, with sometimes dozens of armored vehicles involved in a single column, that would be in an area like this, just to the west of the city of Donetsk, in regions like Marinka, Pobieda, and in the fields in between. And so, as we said before, there's this massive hill over here that overlooks the battlefield with the villages to the north of it. It also overlooks whatever Ukrainian positions are located on valleys further south. And there are a few protruding valleys in this region. The most obvious one is this one over here that you see stretching out. And so the actual height is located squarely on top of the highway over here, which is also a big issue for the Ukrainians were they to lose this position. And most importantly, it overlooks the town of Kurakhove. And so the Russian forces have a vested interest in securing control of these eastern fields to get a great field of vision to fire upon and scan the Ukrainians on their perimeter of the town and also within the town itself, and also the various supply lines. And the supply lines are compromised, potentially compromisable, because of how you have this massive area of the Vavcha River here, and you have a bridge here that's supplying the various parts of the eastern and western bank, for instance, of the river. And so there are potential logistical bottlenecks as the Russians get closer and closer and try to secure local heights. For now, we're going to stick in reality. And the reality is the Russian forces were able to advance 1.7 kilometers westwards. The previous line of contact that we were aware of was based on a geolocation from June 13th. That was over a month ago, also from the 46th Air Assault Brigade, where they targeted Russian columns that were advancing from Kurakhove into Maximilianivka. And you could see how they're doing so along Volitsia Centrala, which is the name of the street, the main street over here. And that's one of the issues with a lot of these advances. Even though they do have a large volume, it makes it harder for Ukraine to individually take out each vehicle or tank, whatever it may be. It is still on a very narrow plane. Sometimes along one road, maybe there's another nearby path, like a field where the Russians are advancing through. But it is within a very concentrated region that we're talking about. So we're talking about a width of like 700 meters of an advance. And so then it becomes easier for artillery and then for drones to concentrate in a singular region, even if the Russians do overpower the Ukrainians. And that's part of why the front line hasn't moved further westwards faster than it has in reality. But nonetheless, there are several instances, and this is one of them, where there have been lapses in the Ukrainian defense here, where they've not been able to maintain continuity and connect with the rest of the Ukrainian garrisons, either south or north. And there's a gap found in the Ukrainian line, and they're pushed back over a kilometer up until the Ukrainians have to muster in reinforcements and then throw all of them at it to try to stabilize the situation. So that's what happened a month ago when the Russians were able to get full control over Kurakhove after really only battling in very long, arduous battles in the eastern portion of Kurakhove. They were able to leapfrog past most of it and advance further westwards due to gaps in the Ukrainian line. That could be due to a lack of coordination between several units, perhaps an issue with the ground forces working with drone crews. It could just be because there weren't enough men to man this part of the village. But that would be an issue because it is, as we said before, a very concentrated and small region. And so even with a disadvantage, the Ukrainians should be able to maintain control with a smaller force. Either way, they suffered that lapse over a month ago, and now they suffered another similar lapse where they were forced to, in a very short period of time, yield to the Russian advances, yield to Russian vehicular advances along the road into Maximilianivka, but also based on the video itself from the Beaver drone units, they were able to strike a lot of these houses where there may have been Russian soldiers present. We don't even know if there were because we don't see actual Russians within those houses. We just see the FPV striking them. And so there is a chance, of course, that no casualties were even inflicted. It could also be that there were several casualties inflicted that we didn't see. All we know is that there were 6 strikes in the compilation, including on 2 houses, on 4 dugouts. And so you also had the Russian forces embedded within either to the north or south tree lines, trying to gradually push through those regions and as a result secure a westwards vector of advance. Right now, you see that based on the Russian attack, they are only about 3 kilometers away from fully capturing the village. And this is after just 1 day of it being confirmed the Russians have infiltrated within Maximilianivka. And it's important because it's the final village along the 0510 highway before reaching Kurakhove. If we're to measure it out from the western edge of the village, then it's only about 3.3 kilometers away from Kurakhove. And if we're measuring from the Russian edge, then it's about 6.2 kilometers away from the town. And Kurakhove, we talked about it for over a year now, about how important it is as a logistics hub for the southern Donetsk agglomeration of Ukrainian forces. That's why the Ukrainians, they were really attentive when it came to building defenses here. And the way they built it, it appears they expected to see more Russian pressure coming directly from the south, from an area like Uspenivka. And that could be because they expected the potential fall, or they were bracing for a scenario in which Vuhledar fell, and then by virtue of that, all of the fields and villages south of it. But it appears that the actual Russian vector of advance is occurring along the eastern direction, where the Ukrainians at the time when they built all these defenses were still defending in Marinka and then in Kurakhove. And so there was a certain element of trust in the Ukrainian forces that they'd be able to maintain continuity at the line of contact for a long period of time to buy the Ukrainians enough time to then solidify control of this eastern perimeter. I don't know if they were able to do that based on the publicly available satellite imagery showing trench lines, which show they may not be fully complete on this eastern approach, which is where the Russians are actually advancing through on at least one highway, but it could also be along 2, given how the Russian salient here is creating the opportunity for a southwards diversion, which would then allow them to get control over another highway to begin advancing closer and closer to Kurakhove. At the very least, it means that the Russians are going to be able to move artillery closer to the front line and begin to fire it even more than they have already been doing into Kurakhove itself. At this point in time, you could have a variety of systems firing. You have short-range artillery, long-range artillery has always been able to fire here from Donetsk itself. Now you could see mortars being moved in specifically to regions like this. And then Russian soldiers themselves, once they get control of hills directly overlooking Kurakhove, which, as we've said before, is on a floodplain, but it is still important because of all the roads that pass through it and all the villages that connect to it as a result. And it used to be utilized as a forward artillery hub for the Ukrainians. At this point, they probably moved it further westwards and northwards. So perhaps in Andriivka, that seems like a logical spot to move it further westwards. But there are likely still some smaller Ukrainian systems, definitely still mortars that are operating in Kurakhove. So it does still serve in that sort of capacity. Also, you have to keep in mind there is this massive hill just north of Kurakhove, which will give the Ukrainians a bit of an advantage where they'll have parity with the Russian forces that are just to the southeast of Kurakhove during the initial advances and battles throughout the town itself. And so that's a bit of a reprieve for the Ukrainians. And they do have an artillery brigade generally floating around here, the 55th Brigade. So again, keep an eye for this front. Now looking a bit to the north at Krasnohorivka, it's not anything too significant, but we do have this small geolocation which confirms an advance of about 100 meters if we're looking at it. It's a video which shows 20 FPV strikes and drone drops conducted by the 108th Mechanized Battalion. I have that battalion marked over here. It was formerly referred to as the Da Vinci drone units, not necessarily just drones, but it also worked as a battalion, an independent battalion. It's been rebranded in recent months following shakeups that were done by Siersky within this particular unit and within the 67th Mechanized Brigade as a whole. So it's no longer associated with that brigade anymore. It is now, I believe, a part of the 59th Brigade, which is generally floating around here. But in any case, this battalion specifically is now confirmed to be involved in defensive activities in Krasnohorivka. Previously had experience in the Chasiv Yar region and elsewhere, and it is a more committed unit with more specialization. So in their compilation, they show how they spotted Russian squads advancing. So in these videos, we actually saw Russian soldiers advancing in a northern direction, trying to secure additional portions of the residential area in the northwestern corner, and how in the houses they entered, they were just targeted by those same drones. And so that's just a small confirmation of continued Russian advances in this region. But more importantly, I want to discuss the developments around New York. So in New York, we received an update from Ukrainian sources, including Petrenko, where they show that the Russian forces were able to extend control westwards from their initial salient that is based entirely around the houses in the southern portion of the town. And so you have this advance amounting to 800 meters westwards through this local road. And my understanding of this is that the Russian forces do want to solidify control over this forested patch here. My mapping is incorrect, but I don't know how to edit it out. But I should note that this region over here does constitute a gray zone. It should not be marked as under Russian control. And so the Russians still are in the process of clearing it out. They would like to get full control over that forested region, but it goes farther than that. The Russian forces do want to get control over the hinterlands in between Yarivka and the rail line here all the way westwards to Alexandropil, and this entire vertical line of villages that then cross past the trenches and the ponds and Sukhabalka, for instance. And the village that the Russians are now getting closer to is Pantelimonivka. And so the entire objective of the Russian forces is to get control over this hinterland region because it is located on a hill. That hill overlooks both chains of villages, whether it be to the west or to the east. Right now, I don't really think the Ukrainians are using it to its full extent because in a vacuum, if you're standing here and overlooking either side, it does have a very significant advantage. But something that I do need to stress when I talk about elevation is that it can only be harnessed in certain contexts. And one way in which it cannot be fully harnessed is when the Russian forces conduct a rapid advance to the east of it, surprise the Ukrainian forces in a region where they initially did not have enough reinforcements. And so they have to scramble to man areas that are within the town itself, have to man trenches. And so then how many men are really left and how many men really are sent into the hinterlands further southwards where it is closer to a gray zone and closer to a line of contact. I don't know how many are even there because if there are troops in the sector, they would likely be further westwards within the villages in areas where they could actually seek refuge in basements or in protected structures. You don't have that in this rectangle over here. All you have is an open field, some tree lines. That is about it. And it becomes extremely dangerous, especially with the Russians launching a large amount of fab bombs on a daily basis here and just raining down artillery. And so that neuters some of the advantage of this height. but it doesn't change the fact that the Russians would want to utilize it themselves, both to secure the western flank of their salient here, which you can see is becoming more and more wide, but also in order to undermine the Ukrainian chain of villages here that is running vertically, in an effort to try to more generally undermine the Ukrainian line of defense that is running horizontally from Kalinove to the west all the way to New York to the east. One way to do that is to get control of the hills that are basically gluing it together in between. In terms of concrete advances, let's zoom in. So I'm using a measuring stick to show the extent of the Russian advance, amounting to something in the ballpark of 700 meters northwest. Here you can see a video from July 22nd. It's from the 425th Skala Assault Battalion, moved in from the Novomikhailivka region. In the video, they utilized at least one Bradley. It dismounts infantry within Petrovska Gora. That's the name of this southwestern suburb of New York. And the infantry, they're dismounted generally around here near this field and near this sports complex. And you can see it's like up over 7 people dismount out of the Bradley or were dismounted in other operations and then are filmed within the drone footage itself. And they're involved in clearing out house to house. So they go throughout these houses over here along this road, whether it be on Sotskoho Street or whatever that street is over here, going through with this fire support from the Bradley, with the autocannon of the Bradley firing into the houses where there are presumably Russian forces trying to clear them out. So we could see that direct engagement, and that's the means by which the Ukrainians are trying to counterattack. At the very least, it means the Ukrainians do still maintain some operational control in the southwestern portion of the town. And the reason why they want to maintain control over it is in order to give them a buffer to buy time to build up within the heartland of New York, but also to prevent the Russians from getting awfully close to the horizontal road over here. Because now the Russians, or really the gray zone, is about 700 meters away from this very important entrance into New York, which is basically the only western entrance into the town. You have a northern entrance which connects, if you zoom out, it connects to Toretsk itself, but that's not as useful when we're looking at frontline operations in this southern sector of the battlefield. And so for a western connection, you need this road over here that I marked in red, and the Russians are about a kilometer away from it, and cutting it off would undermine the Ukrainian defense line in this region and would also hamper the logistics of the Ukrainian defenders in New York itself. So they do want to create a buffer zone with a lot of reinforcements, including some very strong mechanized infantry from the Skala Battalion, a very important assault battalion, to try to create that sort of gap. And in terms of actually succeeding, we don't have proof of the Skala Battalion pushing back the Russians. The only proof it confirms to us is that they're operating in the region and the Russian forces were able to extend their maximum control zone in this region by 700 meters. And it comes at the same time that we have information coming from Petrenko that the Russian forces were able to advance around 700 meters to the northeast along this very important vertical road, Zalizhna Road. This road, it then goes northwards and penetrates past the eastern section of New York. So based on the new reporting from Ukrainian sources, the Russians have completely solidified control over this southeastern corner, which means they have a very strong base to then continue getting deeper and deeper into New York. Right now, the dividing line is this floodplain, and the floodplain itself is really spanning an area of 200 meters, and so it could be traversed by the Russian forces, and by then they would actually be reaching very deep into the center of New York. Another issue would be that the Russians, by virtue of these recent advances, are now very close to tightening the noose around this Ukrainian cauldron. Let's measure the extent of the cauldron. It's about 3 kilometers wide at the moment, so there is still an escape route for the Ukrainians. It really depends on whether they're in the process right now of making a staggered withdrawal or whether they're trying to dig in, and the rationale would be that they do have these very fortified positions, heavily mined all around the fields here, and it is also located, at least to a certain extent, along a hill, which is overlooking New York, where the Russians are currently operating in, and so you do have that advantage when it comes to defensive operations, trying to repel the opponents. But the other issue is that it then makes them vulnerable on the flanks, and the Russian forces will have an opportunity to fully envelop them. That would be a worst case scenario. And so the Ukrainians will have to balance those two factors when they make the decision on when and where to withdraw from. And time really is running out, because although we haven't seen Russian activity from this eastern direction, I haven't seen any videos actually of engagements here. The Russian western flank is getting very strengthened, and they are, as we said before, 200 meters away from this road over here, the Horlivska road that connects between the entirety of Ukraine's garrison in this region, including New York, to the Ukrainian holdouts that are located further eastwards. And so there is a big concern for whatever garrisons remaining here. I don't know if it's in the dozens or in the hundreds or in the low hundreds, perhaps. There's no information coming out from the Ukrainian side surrounding the status here, but it is becoming very dangerous looking at a map. Another issue that's becoming more and more evident is surrounding Pivdenia, where now we have this admittal from deep state that the Russian forces have made a significant advance here. The Russians were able to gain 2.3 square kilometers of land in southern Pivdenia and Zalizhnia. Let's actually show you guys the extent of the advance when you're going southwards, and I'll be very thorough in showing it. It amounts to something in the ballpark of 650 meters going southwards, and then when you're going from west to east, it amounts to like 4 kilometers nearly in width for an advance. So that is really monumental when you look at it. In terms of what was captured, let's try to also show you that. The Russian forces were able to capture a lot of less dense regions of Pivdenia that are located near the slag heaps and near the landfills, quarries, whatever it may be. Those regions, they have a lot of forestry that may not have been destroyed in recent fighting, because the fighting here has been intermittent up until the past month, where we've seen tensions flare up over here. And so the Russian forces were able to capture a lot of shrubbery, some houses in the process, backyards. And because the area is less dense, the Ukrainians also built a massive amount of fortifications near the ceasefire line. And a lot of those have now been captured by the Russian forces. And the Ukrainians have been forced to give them up after working on them for, in some cases, 10 years. They no longer had any ability to maintain control of those positions because they were being flanked from the north and from the east. There was way too much pressure, and the main garrisons were located way further west. The supply lines just weren't working for them. So they had to abandon it, either on their own accord or due to just the Russians being able to push over there, sensing weakness on the Ukrainian lines. And so as a result of all this, the Russian forces have been able to capture this massive slag heap over here, and then this nearby quarry facility, and then this massive slag heap, another massive landfill. It just keeps on going on and on. So many strategically significant heights that right now, if you're comparing elevation, then they overlook all of this Ukrainian salient to the south, where there are also a lot of trenches and some ponds and a few houses if you're zooming in. And so that salient is also under a lot of threat right now. It's not as cut off. It's not as narrow. Or actually, it is in this case. It's about 3 kilometers wide. And then you do have the issue of elevation and the issue of logistics. You don't really see many clear routes to resupply the Ukrainian forces in the deep end over here. You also have the issue surrounding how these various heights that the Russians have secured will overlook the rest of Zalizhnia, where there are currently battles going on. Zalizhnia itself is for the most part located on a height. We're actually going to visualize it for you guys once again. Shumi's on a height. It extends further southwards, actually westwards into Pivnishnia. It extends further to the southwest into Zalizhnia, and into its northeastern suburb of Zalizhnia, and then into the southwestern portion of Zalizhnia, that suburb, where I have this X marked. And so at a certain point near the vertical road that bisects the suburbs, this road over here that I'm going over with my cursor, that's generally the dividing line where it starts to turn into a lower lying valley. A lot of the height advantage is taken away as a result. And it's generally happening along the road or just to the west of the road. And so then you have an issue where the Russian forces are definitely going to have an ability to overlook from these slag heaps and get a view of the new Ukrainian defense line that is built along that highway, which is being protected by the largest slag heap in the region that is marked in X. And that's one of Ukraine's crown jewels in the area. And the Ukrainians would have really hoped to buy more time in Zalizhnia, because up until a week ago, the situation was more stable here in the suburb. But the Russian forces were able to penetrate gaps here, particularly from the eastern region over here, and push very deep into houses. They were able to do so on foot or through a few vehicles in rather small amounts, and then infiltrate, create a foothold that the Ukrainians were unable to push back, really was impregnable. And then from there, just continue expanding, making the salient more wide, making it impossible for the Ukrainian 32nd Brigade to organize a tank counterattack, for instance, and all being done with support from the Ghost FPV unit targeting incoming Ukrainian reinforcements. And the result is they've now been able to go house to house and clear out a lot of these private residential areas. There is still a lot of work to be done in the southern district over here, where there's going to be a lot of heavy fighting. There's also going to be a lot of fighting in the direct eastern approaches of the highway, because that's where the Ukrainians are setting up their secondary line of defense. And so advancing even further westwards is going to become a massive challenge. But in terms of solidifying control over all of the suburbs to the east, the Russians are currently doing that, and they're doing that at a pace that the Ukrainians would not have hoped for. They would have hoped that all the reinforcements from the various mechanized brigades they sent in would have bought them enough time to have at least a bit of leniency when it comes to setting up additional defenses, moving in new forces into that region, securing the perimeter. And now they're just not going to be afforded that time. They're going to have to go immediately into frontline combat along their new defense line that is centered around this vertical or sort of diagonal road. So really my point with all of this is to show that the Russian forces were able to also capture additional land, not just within southern Zalizhnia, which we could see marked over here, an advance of over 1.3 kilometers to the southwest, but also in the region just in between. So you do have this district over here and this district here. These are the two main sections, and they create a V shape. And so the V area, the shaded region in between with the field, is now largely under Russian control. It's a region that, if we measure it out, constitutes about, let's see, about 0.5 square kilometers, and it creates a unity between the two vectors here, because you did have this independent vector created by the Russians at the beginning of the month to this apartment complex, where it has been bogged down ever since. And then you have this near rejuvenated attack over here, and at the same time the Russians are connecting them together, which will make the Russian momentum more forceful, and then concentrate pressure towards these apartment complexes that are sort of acting as a vanguard to prevent the Russian forces from directly reaching the second line of defense. And lastly, we have the Chasiv Yar front. The Russian forces are now looking northwards, focusing on clearing out remaining Ukrainian presence within the eastern section of the canal. And so what's going on is now you have the Russians getting control of the remaining heights just to the northwest of Bodanivka. They recently advanced around 650 meters to the northwest, securing these fields that I'm marking in an X here. That is their objective. The goal then would be to essentially reach the trench system over here that's along the canal, and by then overlook Krasnohorivka, make it impossible for the Ukrainians to continue operating over there. And that would essentially give the Russians a very strong northern flank to then begin crossing over into fields that are located just north of Chasiv Yar, in conjunction with their current operations that are going on within Salient itself. And so it's all a part of the same concerted effort. And the Ukrainians, of course, they are trying to stop Russian troop accumulations from getting closer to the front line. So just as one example, you have now the Ochi-I drone units, which I thought was previously operating on the northern border, but now I see videos from them over here. So they're trying to target these various Russian troop concentrations eastwards in Berkivka. So you can see some Russian forces that were beginning to organize over there as they make their journey to the front line and are trying to expel the Ukrainians from the rest of the eastern bank of the canal. And the Ochi drone unit is a part of the 23rd Mechanized Brigade, had a lot of experience around the Velika and Vasilka sector during the counteroffensive, and also around Avdiivka in recent months, but it's now been moved to help continue with defensive activities on the Chasiv Yar front. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.